I have had stammering since I was a kid, since as long as I can remember. As I struggled with my speech through school, eventually, around grade 9 or 10, I chanced upon a technique which helped me stammer less, prefacing words with the S sound, or as we now know it as crutch 4. This helped me improve my speech significantly, but didn't really help me with my speech on the phone, the speech situation which I dreaded the most. In fact, the one I still dread the most. Whenever the phone would ring, I would find some way to escape from the room, thereby allowing me not to pick it up. In situations when I had no choice but to pick it up, I'd always walk with the phone to a different room so that nobody in the house could see and hear me struggle as I communicated on the phone. Eventually, the pain associated with speaking to others in general, but more specifically on the phone, increased beyond the pain and friction of taking some corrective action. At this point, I realized that I would have to practice speaking on the phone to improve. But now, with whom should one begin practicing? Who would be generous and kind enough to spare their precious time practicing talking to me? The resolution of this dilemma seems very obvious to me in hindsight. It didn't seem so obvious and simple back then. One day, as I was combing through the newspapers, I realized that most of the newspaper ads had given their phone numbers. They were spending money so that people would call them. This was a eureka moment for me. I put two and two together and began looking for potential speech partners in the newspapers. Eventually, based on my interests and the frequency of different ads, I decided to focus on vacation packages advertised by travel companies such as Thomas Cook. I began spending about 30 to 40 minutes per day calling up two to three different travel companies and inquiring about their different travel packages to all parts of the world. Now, since my objective was to speak as much as I could per call to maximize my practice time, the salesmen on the other end found themselves being asked increasingly weird questions as I'd begun to run out of more normal questions to ask. Over time, not only did I begin to feel more comfortable talking on the phone, I unexpectedly became the travel expert my extended family would consult before planning their trips. Eventually, when I began to run out of travel companies to practice my speech with, I decided to move on to another of my interests, cars. As I repeated the same process of questions and long conversations with car salesmen over the phone and improved in confidence, I realized that I had garnered significant knowledge about cars. Around this time, I graduated from college and moved to a place called Gurgaon, not far from Delhi, the capital of India, to begin my first job. Now, one day, as I was heading home from work, I realized just how fast luxury cars like BMWs, Mercedes, Audis were whizzing past my humble small car on this 8-lane highway. As I was doing my usual calls to the car companies from the newspapers to practice my speech on the phone that day, one of the salesmen, being totally convinced that somebody asking so many questions is bound to be a serious customer, asked if I'd like to test drive the car. And if so, he'd be happy to bring it to my house the next day. I was a bit hesitant to test drive an expensive car, as I had not driven an expensive car till then. But the fresh mental image of that exquisite 8-lane highway nearby convinced me to say yes. The next day's 45-minute test drive on the 8-lane highway at speeds of over 140 kilometers per hour convinced me that I had chanced upon a golden egg. Over the next 2 months, I test drove over 30 cars for about 45 minutes each on this 8-lane highway, including multiple BMWs, multiple Mercedes, multiple Audis, and even a Porsche Boxster. Eventually, when the salesman would call back after a few days of the test drive to inquire about my decision. I would tell the BMW guy that I bought the Mercedes guy that I bought the Audi, and the Audi guy, well, you get the point. This repeated exercise of starting with a long phone call and ending with a long test drive, peppering the salesman with questions all along, improved my confidence tremendously. Not just in talking on the phone and talking in person, but also in general. Over time, as I became complacent, I stopped doing these phone calls. And lo and behold, my speech began to suffer. The old anxieties resurfaced, and so did the uhs every few words. Eventually, a couple of years ago, I came across Lee's book and read it end to end in a couple of days. I sensed real hope when I read his book. I began doing my reading practices, practicing the crutches, especially 4 and 11, and doing affirmations. A few weeks later, I sent an email to Lee without much hope of a response back. Well, respond he did. And over the next few months, practicing with him, I found my speech improving and my confidence improving. Lee suggested incorporating an affirmation targeted specifically towards speaking on the phone. I love speaking on the phone, as I have practiced the last couple of years, at first sporadically, and then in the last year or so, almost every single day. I find my speech much improved in person and especially on the phone. Another resource that's been invaluable the last few months has been the SAC website, where I have gone back to go through Lee's video lectures in the anxiety course to refresh my memory on the key principles and practices, especially on days when I am feeling anxious, fearful, and pessimistic about my speech. I had a chat with Lee this week, and when he asked me when was the last time I appeared speech disabled, I thought about it for a few seconds, but couldn't come up with any instance uh, that I could remember, which is great and illustrates that I have come a long way. I wouldn't say, however, I love to speak yet, certainly not on the phone, but I do believe that by practicing Lee's methods daily, sincerely, I will get there, like many of you. I think the Speech Club is also a great place to get inspired by other folks who have beaten it, to listen to their stories and march on. And finally, thanks Lee for sharing your wonderful methods to help all of us PWS not just see light at the end of the tunnel, but also for hand holding us as we cross it.